Hello, and welcome to episode 150 of Prose. This week, see what happens when a love story falls apart. Well, just before you get listening, I wanted to note that if you haven't listened to episode 149 just yet, you're going to want to go listen to that first. That was from 2 weeks ago. This is a continuation of What We Cannot Hear by S.A. McKenzie. Episode 149, released on January 23rd, contained Heavy is the Head and Silence Like Cancer Grows. And this week we'll see us continue that story, with 2 more parts of the tale falling underneath the novella of What We Cannot Hear. I'll cut my usual rambling short so we can get right back into the tales. But I would ask that everyone goes to prosepodcast.com and just gives it a browse. There are a whole lot of connections to other bits and bobs about prose there, so do consider heading over to prosepodcast.com and giving that a shake. But for now, let's get to the continuation of this tale, shall we? This week, we have What We Cannot Hear. You're gonna lose the war? And This Is What It Looks Like, or The Death of the Lovers. Enjoy! What We Cannot Hear. Part 3. You're gonna lose the war. Sometimes, silence was more deafening than anything Joseph had ever heard. Like the deep quiet of mid-February night blanketed in newly fallen snow. Like the office, nearly devoid of workers in his wing after hours. He liked imagining he heard the dull drone of a vacuum cleaner in another part of the White House, but that was just his own blood rushing through his ears. Ronnie had gone home early, exhausted from a day spent with White House counsel in preparation for Spencer's deposition tomorrow. Joseph had urged Spencer to do so as well, but the last time he checked, about an hour ago, she was still in her office going over reports that didn't need going over, trying to keep her mind busy. He felt bad for her, but there was nothing he could do. The impeachment process was long and arduous, and it was only just beginning. House Republicans and the Speaker, a 30-year veteran of Congress who'd just barely held on to that prestigious seat during the last election, announced a month ago that President Wagner would be investigated. They were empowering various oversight committees to look into whether hiring Spencer and Ronnie was an abuse of power, claiming it was improperly done. Other things were on the docket as well, including an inquiry into Wagner's campaign and budget reports that came out in January, but he and the president knew it was simply a power grab. That knowledge didn't make it any easier, though, especially as oversight committees scared Joseph for many reasons. He tried not to consider what might be uncovered, but in the silence of the office, it was hard not to indulge the thoughts and voices in his head. They were constantly telling him to run, to resign, to spill his guts to Spencer about what happened on the campaign trail. Everything. If he did, he wasn't sure she would forgive him this time. Not after doing so recently. And he wasn't willing to lose her again. Not after working so hard to earn her back. Maybe it was a fool's errand, especially considering he had no idea what her deposition would include. But he could hope. He hadn't lost that yet. The silence of the room bothered him as he sat there, shuffling through a file on his desk. It was something about the NEA that Penny, Ike, and Nate were working on. It wasn't important, but he was trying to read it anyway, He briefly thought about turning on the radio, creating some background noise. But he didn't, and he didn't know why. A shrill ring suddenly pierced the quiet, startling him, his heart throbbing in his ears and pounding in his chest. He cursed under his breath and picked up the headset. "This is Ellis." "Joseph, it's a pleasure to hear your voice again." In the ensuing pause, the hollow rush of ice-cold blood rumbled in his ears before he spoke. The thumping in his chest intensified as his stomach dropped to his feet. He felt like he would throw up. "Desmond?" "Yes, sir." He blew out a breath. God damn it. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Joseph asked, teeth clenched. "Oh, Joseph, don't be so upset to hear from me." "What makes you think I am upset?" "I know you too well." The fact was he did. Every secret, every lie, every dirty little part of the Wagner campaign they tried to keep hidden. Desmond knew all of it. It was only a matter of time before he revealed everything, and it was Joseph's job to ensure that didn't happen. He knew there was a possibility nothing he did would stop it, but that didn't matter. Desmond was the linchpin around which it all turned, and he just so happened to be an influential reporter with the Washington Post. But before that, he was a media consultant for the Wagner campaign. Just then, he realized Desmond would be on the docket of both the Oversight Committee and Financial Services for questioning. Oh, no. He still hadn't told Spencer. "Don't remind me." "Oh, but I will." Joseph blew out a long breath. "What can I do for you, Desmond?" "I need you to do me a favor." His immediate reaction was to tell him no. Tell him to disappear, take a long fall off a short cliff. But he couldn't. As much as he wanted to, he had no choice. No. He couldn't help it. Years of rebellion had conditioned him to fight against the inevitable, even if it was unavoidable. "You know you can't tell me no, Joseph." Another long breath. Joseph pinched the bridge of his nose. It was too late for these games, but he had no other choice. "One more time, what can I do for you?" "I want access to Dr. Thompson." Everything inside the chief of staff recoiled, but he forced himself to swallow the bile and harsh words he wished to fling at the man. "Why?" he asked, fingers strangling the headset. "Why do you need to talk to her?" "She's pivotal to the Republicans' case against the president." "Everybody thinks she's important, Desmond," Joseph snapped, not caring if the other man heard the defensive tone in his voice. "She's not important at all." For a long moment, Desmond didn't speak, and the elder statesman thought maybe, just maybe, he had dissuaded the younger man from pursuing Spencer. That was all Joseph needed, for Desmond to go poking around in places he didn't belong. The psychologist was not a sideshow freak for everyone to gawk at. He didn't pretend to know what her life was like before him, before her fiancé took his life, but he could imagine it. Raised in a hearing world, forced to conform to a normalcy she could never achieve, she likely always felt less than. And that was without mention of the bullying. For the way she spoke, for her deafness, for simply being a person of color. She'd told him snippets, but it was clear none of it was good. None of it something she wanted to talk about. And she certainly didn't want to go through anything like that again. And yet, there she was, forced into depositions, trotted out in the media as a villain, someone to be despised and looked down upon for simply existing. And there was Desmond, the one person he didn't want near her. The one person he couldn't say no to. Mr. Ellis, need I remind you that once I talked to Oversight and Financial Services, your job as Chief of Staff is over. The unspoken and hung in the silence between them. And President Wagner might not have a job when I'm through either. Joseph swallowed thickly, trying not to think about any of this. If I hand her over to you? You know how competent a liar I am, Desmond replied, an obvious smirk in his tone. He'd snagged the Chief of Staff fair and square. The elder statesman thought for a long moment. Before responding, I'll do it. She'll do it. Under one condition. The other man chuckled. I don't negotiate. I don't give a damn what you do and don't do. I'll take my chances in that case, and you can do your worst. An angry sniff echoed over the handset. What's your condition? I want to be there with her. There was a long pause. And I want to tell her what I did in private. Oh, you mean you haven't already? Joseph wanted to strangle the other man, but held his temper. Do we have a deal or not? A short huff sounded on the line before Desmond's voice came again. Short, to the point, and obviously upset Joseph hadn't taken the bait. Tomorrow, after her deposition, an exclusive interview. If you don't show up, I won't lie. Then the phone went dead. The next day passed in a blur. Joseph was unsure where meetings ended or began. He was distracted, dreading the moment Penny would return from the hill. More than once, Ken attempted to discover what was going on, but each time Joseph waved him off. The last thing the other man needed on his plate was that Desmond Richards was about to scoop an exclusive interview with Spencer. In fact, if he'd attempted to warn the president of that, his friend and boss might just explode. Come to think of it, so might the communications director. He checked his watch just before lunch, thinking Spencer should surely be finished with her deposition by then. He hoisted himself up from his desk and ambled down the hall to the fishbowl where she and Ronnie's offices were. Coming around the corner, he poked his head into her office door. Spencer was behind her desk, rubbing her temples with the tips of her fingers. The telltale signs of her trying to take deep breaths to calm herself were evident. His heart clenched in his chest as he took a deep breath of his own and waved to get her attention. Joseph, she breathed out his name like a hallelujah from her lips. Her savior. He smiled and tried not to let her know anything was amiss. Hi, how did the deposition go? She shrugged. Okay, I guess. Her brow furrowed for a moment. They kept asking me questions I couldn't answer. What about? He stepped further into the office, shutting the door behind him. The campaign. Things they think I should know, I guess. He glowered, annoyed. Because you're a therapist. She nodded. Yes, I think so. They think we're stupid, he said dryly. That any old therapist will simply blow into town and we'll spill our guts without a care in the world. No offense. Huh. Spencer laughed, standing from her desk to cross over to him. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets to hide that they were clenched in both anger and anxiety. As always, she saw right through him, and as soon as she was standing in front of him, she laid her hands on his arms and ran them up and down, soothing him. Then, almost without warning, her arms wrapped tightly around him in a bear hug. He wanted to return it, wanted to wrap his arms around her and never let her go. She was his lifeline, but after what he had done, what he had to do to keep them afloat, it was not going to end well. Perhaps she noticed his inner turmoil, the rigidness in his posture, the way he wouldn't return her embrace because she pulled back, signing with a concerned expression, "Are you okay?" His breath shuddered through him. He shook his head. "There's something I need to tell you." Desmond wasn't anything like Spencer expected. When Joseph set her down and explained to her what happened on the campaign trail, things she wouldn't dare repeat, she imagined someone akin to a demon with a smarmy smirk and dead eyes. She pictured gnarled teeth and matted hair, messy clothes, and long, sharp, dirty fingernails. Some part of her simply didn't register that he held a respectable job in journalism, so she imagined the worst. The person she met was handsome as hell. Tall and sporting short-cropped black hair, he was impeccably dressed in freshly pressed clothes that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and starch. His skin was a reddish-brown umber that reminded her of the damp autumn hillsides of her hometown in Maine. When she walked into his office, he immediately smiled brightly. A gap between his two front teeth she had to force herself to suppress a small giggle over. They shook hands, and his grip felt warm, gentle, yet strong. She felt her cheeks darken with the blush. If Desmond knew, he didn't say anything, and she thanked the stars he didn't. "You're the famous Spencer Thompson," he greeted her happily. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "I wish I could say the same," she replied. But her words didn't carry their usual bite. "Come now. Anyone who's a friend of Joseph's is a friend of mine." Her eyes narrowed. It felt like a lie, and yet somehow didn't at the same time. Spencer didn't know how to react. "Joseph said you wanted to speak to me." "I do." He seemed to hesitate for a moment, and Spencer wasn't sure if she should take her chances and run, or lay into him for being such a horrible person. But was he really? She gave him the benefit of the doubt. "Have you eaten dinner yet?" The question threw her for a loop, but in the interest of appearing amiable for President Wagner and Joseph's sakes, she didn't resist. "I have not." "I have a standing reservation at Yushige. Their food is exquisite, and I know for a fact Joseph hasn't taken you out on the town." "And why do you say that?" She snapped a little, hands crossing over her chest, closed off, wary. "I've known Joseph for longer than you have, hun." She bristled slightly, but he was telling the truth, at least while sticking to known facts. She watched as he put on his coat and scarf. All of his clothing was designer. "What makes you think I want to go with you?" "I read people phenomenally well." Spencer swallowed thickly, as he held out a hand for her to take. "Shall we?" She gently pressed her hand into his, holding it as he whisked her from his office and out to his shiny red Audi. The last thing she remembered thinking was, what else had Joseph lied to her about? What We Cannot Hear. Part 4. This is what it looks like, or The Death of the Lovers.
You mean to tell me that I sat in a meeting with you and you didn't have the gall to tell me you were drunk on the campaign trail and might have misused campaign funds to buy drugs off the street?
Spencer roared in Joseph's face. Under any other circumstance, she wouldn't be using her voice to talk, but Ronnie wasn't there, and this was between him and her, no one else. She came back to the present. The drive to Gyushige, situated in a modern shopping district in Fairfax, Virginia, took about 30 minutes from D.C. and was punctuated by silence. She watched the scenery go by in a blur of grays and browns and greens, and she couldn't help but think that maybe she should be speaking. He was a journalist, after all. The interview with her started the moment she walked into Desmond's office. But none of this felt like a traditional interview. Shouldn't there be questions? Shouldn't he be trying to talk to her more? Maybe he understood how hard it was to talk in the car when he needed to face forward and not toward her. Whatever the explanation for the silence, it did nothing to calm the nerves raging in her stomach. She appreciated the invitation to dinner, but sitting there on expensive Italian leather, the seats in his shiny red Audi had been reupholstered. Smelling the faint traces of Desmond's aftershave and cologne, she was afraid that the act of eating would not go well when they finally made it to the restaurant. But she was prepared to do whatever she needed to do to keep Joseph and the president out of trouble. Joseph didn't deserve that courtesy.
What was I supposed to do? There were at least 3 senators in that meeting too, Spencer. You could have told me that after the fact. Oh yeah, imagine us laying in bed, me saying that, "Oh, by the way, Spencer, I wasn't just drunk, I also misused Oxycontin and dabbled in heroin." Yeah, that would have gone over real well. The sarcasm oozed from every pore in his body. She didn't need to hear to know his tone of voice dripped with it as well. The tightness in her body caught and squeezed more. Her chest hurt like hell. But there she was, waiting to arrive at the restaurant. The pain in her chest still hadn't abated. If anything, it only amplified. She could go for something spicy right then to ground her, and she hoped they were close. Maybe she could stomach something, if only to keep her anxiety at bay. It was then the car rolled to a stop and she felt Desmond's warm hand on her knee, drawing her attention back to him. "We're here." She nodded, forcing out a soft "thank you" before she climbed out of the car and stretched languidly, hoping to expel the tightness she felt clenching in every muscle in her body. She felt his eyes on her but didn't cease her movements. Only when she was finished stretching did she turn to face him, brown eyes expectant and curious as she rounded the trunk of the car to light beside him. "Lead the way." He held out his arm and she took it, her stomach doing flip-flops, the tightness in her chest abating, but she had to swallow the bitter taste of bile that rose to the back of her throat. He didn't revile her. The situation did, and she'd been playing the last 3 hours over and over again in her head, the thoughts distracting her but not nearly as much as Desmond had.
She thought back to their introduction, not but 30 minutes ago. The way Joseph described him made him seem like some crooked-toothed monster, dripping slime from his mouth and his devil horns. But he hadn't been like that, and he still wasn't. Maybe that was what was making her anxiety spike. She was expecting the nastiness to drop at any time. She was steeling herself for it. She needed to stop.
Wait, what you're saying is you didn't trust me enough to tell me.
Joseph carded a hand through his graying hair. That's not it at all.
Then what is it, Joseph? Why couldn't you tell me this one simple thing? Did you think I'd think less of you? For Christ's sake, I understand addiction. I'm a therapist, you know?
That's exactly why I couldn't tell you. You're a therapist.
Penny took a deep breath and rubbed her chest. So you didn't trust me. That's exactly what it was. You didn't trust me because of my profession. She watched him take a deep breath, trying to force back the frustration, but it plumed quickly into anger. His jaw clenching tightly, nose flaring. But she didn't want to back down. My being a therapist threatens everything you hold dear, Joseph. You can't hide that from me.
The hell I can't. This hurts me, Dr. Brewer. He pointed at himself, finger pressing deep into the fabric of his shirt at his chest. I tell you, and it hurts the administration.
That's all you care about, isn't it? The administration. Heaven forbid your girlfriend gets hurt by your actions. She's just collateral damage.
His face darkened and she felt the need to take a step back from him. The smell of food wafted around her and she took a deep breath, a small smile curving over her lips as she glanced at Desmond. Even in profile, he was handsome. She tried not to think about the bad things Joseph had said about him. Surely his words had been tainted by his anger. That's the only thing she could think of. She was pulled away from her thoughts when, suddenly, she was free of his arm, but his strong, warm hand settled on the small of her back, leading her to a little booth tucked in the corner away from the hustle. He pulled out the chair opposite the wall for her, so her back was against the crowd when she sat down. He sat in front of her as a waitress came up beside the table. "What would you like to drink?" She considered it a moment. "A whiskey ember, please," she politely told the waitress. "I'll have the same," he ordered with a pleased and impressed little expression. The waitress disappeared as Spencer reached forward to fiddle with her impeccably wrapped silverware. Her eyes remained trained on him, waiting. "You're afraid of me. You're surprised?" "Not in the slightest." Spencer laughed. "To tell you the truth, I thought you were going to be scarier, I suppose." He snorted and shook his head. "No doubt all the stories Joseph has told about me. He doesn't like me, but then again, he doesn't like journalists either." "Or therapists?" she retorted dryly as their waitress brought them their drinks. "That's a shame." She took a pull from her glass and let the warmth and the spiciness settle on her tongue before she swallowed the alcohol down smoothly. "Do you like therapists?" "I like what therapists do. I've never been to one myself." "No one says you have to go to therapy. What works for some doesn't work for others." He smirked and sat back in his chair a little, surveying her closely, heat blooming in her cheeks under his gaze. "Does therapy work for you? Therapists heal thyself and all that jazz?" Spencer took another pull from her drink to hide the surprise she felt at those questions. She should have expected them. did, but didn't expect them so soon. Are you trying to undermine my work? He lifted an eyebrow, be it in surprise or admiration, or both, she couldn't tell. Explain. You know journalists. I am one? He quickly interjected. Yes. Well, you're all the same. You see a high-ranking woman and you see fit to attack her emotional and mental well-being because women only rule through their emotions. They're too emotional to act through logic. His eyebrow lifted even higher. What a high opinion of me, he retorted dryly. She laughed, nervously trying to calm herself, but now that she was at the restaurant, she was feeling bold, competent, ready to take this man down a peg or two. It's true, isn't it? I've read your opinion pieces. Joseph warned me you'd try to attack me, use my feelings against me to get information about this administration. That was before I met you, he said nonchalantly. Without even thinking about or tempering her response, she burst out laughing, perusing the menu as she tried to bite back the laugh, lest watchful and curious eyes land on her. Could you be any more cliché? Desmond didn't answer. Instead, he relayed his order off to her left, and she realized the waitress was there. The waitress's eyes lingered on her, no doubt sizing her up and wondering what could be so funny. Spencer ignored her and quickly settled on the duck and some vegetables. They handed over their menus, and Desmond finally gave her what she was hoping for. A laugh.
You aren't collateral damage, Joseph assured, but the darkness in his blue eyes didn't assuage the fear percolating in her belly. Then what exactly am I, Joseph? You keep doing this to me, keeping secrets, keeping me in the dark. What am I supposed to think? That the administration is more important than you. He lingered on a pause for far too long. Her blood boiled. Then either of us. He followed. She took a deep breath and longed to see the lightness in his eyes again. Not this anger or contempt, the blatant denial of her and whatever it was they had together. She was beginning to think it was all an illusion. He wouldn't be acting like this if she truly meant something to him, would he? Was this administration more important when you revealed we were dating without consulting me or without me in the room? That was different, he replied defensively, beginning to fiddle with some of the papers on his desk. Different how? She could feel the crack in her voice and the sting of tears in her eyes, but she willed them away. The muscle in his jaw clenched, unclenched. Icy blue eyes regarded her closely. It's not important. What's important right now is your meeting with Desmond. She met that gaze with fiery amber eyes. And if I refuse? I expect your resignation by 5 o'clock this evening. Everything in her body recoiled. Her stomach lurched, and if she hadn't have forgotten to eat lunch, she might have thrown up right there. Swallowing down bile, she held his gaze. That tactic might intimidate most other staffers, but she was not so outwardly cowed by his anger and his foul demands. Go to hell, she spat. I'll go for the administration. I'm not doing it for you. Spencer turned on her heel and left with a vicious slam of the door. He didn't warn you about that, did he? She shook her head. I didn't think so. I'm more cliché than he gives me credit for. Penny wrinkled her nose. Can we not talk about him? Trouble in paradise, he teased. She didn't dignify that with an answer. No, I was simply under the presumption you wanted a story on me, not him. And I do. You're right.
The therapist leaned back into her chair and nursed her whiskey ember. Then, what would you like to know? Other than if I see a therapist in my free time. I'd like to know how you got involved with the administration. Her lips pursed into a thin line, but she quipped quickly. President Wagner likes people who are smarter than him. I beg to differ on that. Why? Because you're smarter than him and you don't work for him anymore? Desmond smirked. I chose not to work for him anymore. After what you found out about Joseph? What about Joseph? He asked coolly, finishing his drink. Her eyes narrowed, confused. You don't know? He assured me you did since you worked on the campaign. What I know and what he thinks I know are finite in number. Their food finally came and she was left with the realization that she was right. Joseph lied about a lot. When their food was finished, Spencer was laughing so hard she felt tears rolling down her cheeks. Desmond was a breath of fresh air, a welcomed reprieve from the worry about the impeachment trial and what had been happening with Joseph. She felt a weight lifting from her chest, and for the first time in days, she felt more like herself. It felt wonderful to be able to sit and enjoy a meal without press and the intrusion into her life. But he was the press. And despite his amiable nature and the way he'd been, something still felt off. I assume that this won't be the last meeting we attend together, she said as she reined in her laughter, reaching down to grab her purse, intent on at least leaving a tip or part of one. No, your profile isn't quite finished yet. Are you sure I'm interesting enough for a profile? You're the most interesting woman I've ever met. She laughed, snorted, and attempted not to begin laughing in full again. What did I say about being cliché? It's not cliché if the flattery is true, you know. She pulled out some money and laid it on the table. I don't believe that for a second. She leveled her gaze at him. You're fishing, Mr. Richards, and once you get what you want, I'll be destroyed, and whatever this is, she motioned grandly, will have been inconsequential. He stared at her, long and hard, and she shifted under his gaze. It was unlike Joseph's cold gaze earlier. While his was angry and full of contempt, Desmond's expression was searching, trying to find a weak spot, trying to wiggle under her skin, inhabit her bones. She swallowed thickly and tried to ignore the heat blooming in places it shouldn't be. Nothing I do is inconsequential, he admitted firmly before standing from the table and offering her an arm. Come with me. It wasn't a question so much as a demand. Spencer obeyed, standing and linking their arms together. She could have told him no. She could have spit in his face and denied everything she felt crackling between them. She could have cut off his access to her, but she didn't want that. Desmond wasn't anything like Joseph told her he was. She followed him willingly. You're the most interesting woman I've ever met. The administration is more important than you. That was before I met you. I expect your resignation by 5 o'clock. The war of words in her mind was stifled by the cool satin sheets of Desmond's bed as they tangled around her soft skin, umber against russet, engulfed in a sea of blue and warmth that spread through her body, silencing the harsh words, the lies. A gasp of Desmond's name was uttered in pleasure. The amber eyes met amber, but all she could see was blue. Cerulean satin, navy walls, cobalt in a painting behind his right shoulder. Cobalt, the color of Joseph's eyes. What had she done? Thank you for listening to parts 3 and 4 of What We Cannot Hear by S.A. McKenzie. S.A. McKenzie likes her stories like she likes her character actors. Warm, fuzzy, a bit worn in, and with a bit of emotion. She began writing at the age of 13 and focused on fan fiction. Now, she divides her time between short stories, film, and television-based articles, and her upcoming novel. Her short story Snapshots is currently available to buy on Amazon. Thank you so much to S.A. McKenzie for allowing us to feature her work today. All sounds you've heard this week come from YouTube's free music library or freesound.org. Everything is being used under a CC 01.0 public domain dedication license. Well, that does it for Prose this week. Please join us in 2 weeks' time where we'll have one more little taste of Miss McKenzie's writing, as well as yet another short story from yours truly. Please do your best to love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is. Always stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.